Oh, hello and welcome.
Hello.
Thank you,
Hello.
Jeanette and Isabel, for joining me. I'm so excited for our first episode of Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood, our new YouTube series from the Women of Color Health Equity Collective. And I'm so happy to have both of you as our first guests on for this session. For a topic that is interesting for all of us, though. It's going to be an exciting, and I can't wait for us to have some conversation. So I think it's best that we start with some introduction so folks know who we are. So I'm Janice Catalina. I'm co-executive director of the Women of Color Health Equity Collective. I use she, her pronouns, ella in Spanish, and then I also identify as a brown skin, Puerto Rican, Latina woman. So I will turn it over and you all can introduce yourselves and share whatever feels comfortable for you as part of your identity. But Jeanette, can you go next?
Sure. I'm Gina Rivera. They, ella, pronouns all work. I am the co-creator of La Diaspora Art Space in Chicopee. And I identify as an Afro-Boricua Taino.
Thank you. And Isabel, can you go next?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel Garcia. She, her pronouns. And I am the founder of Estoy Aquí, a suicide prevention education initiative with a social justice focus. I identify as Latina, Afro-Caribbean, and Dominican.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both for sharing a little bit about yourselves. And I love too that you both are creators or founders or essentially entrepreneurs in your own way too. So this is exciting. I'm thinking about what you had to navigate to go through that too. I thought, in honor of it coming to the end of Hispanic Heritage Month, that we all have a little bit of conversation around identity and what it means to be Hispanic or Latina or Latinx or Latine, right? So many terms now that have come out and shifted over time and thinking about what that is. So I was curious, first of all, around the different terms, right? So when I was growing up, it was Hispanic and that's all we had, right? And now we've developed so many different terms to really apply and be more inclusive of folks. So we have Latinx and we have Latine, or people still identify as Latino or Latina. And I was curious from the both of you, kind of what those terms mean for you or how those terms have shown up in your lives and understanding how they apply.
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, growing up Hispanic, and ironically, there were some local groups that referred to us as Spanish, and those were really the terms I was familiar with as a child. And now we have this inclusive terminology, and then there's still some challenges, right, with Latinx being not part of the language, the original language, and like why do we use that? And then I think if I don't even know the evolution, but I feel like then Latine like was the evolution afterwards because that was a little bit more natural. And I personally am okay with any of them. I don't like boxes. I don't like labels so much, but I understand how they can be helpful and I understand how they build community. So personally, I'm good with all three.
Yeah, however the person chooses, right? That's how it.
Right. In my case, I was born and raised in the Dominican Republic. I immigrated to the U.S. 13 years ago, and I was 15. And over there, none of that Hispanic, Latino, none of that. Never heard of it. It was only you're Dominican or mestiza, right? Mestiza, mestizo, mulatto, mulata, or India. So over there, if I had to choose a category, I would probably say mulata in India because my skin color over there was like, oh, tú eres India, you're India, or whatever. And then, so yeah, back there, I didn't use Hispanic or Latino or anything like that. Then when I came here, I was like, oh, okay, so I'm not only Dominican, there's a bunch of other stuff. And yeah, that's how I was introduced to these terms in a dentist's office when I was filling out a form that had the demographics, and you had to choose the race and ethnicity. I didn't know that there was a difference between race and ethnicity either. So it was a whole thing. It was part of, I definitely was really confused, and I had to Google all these things. So my my entire development has been basically held by Google. I had no clue at all. In my case, I say Latino, Latinx. I don't say either Latino, like I put them together because I understand that there are people who don't use Latinx because they feel it's not, it feels that like they're betraying their culture by saying Latinx, by not saying it like in or the original or whatever. But I also understand the inclusion of the LGBTQ community. And as someone with privilege, as cisgender, straight person, I feel I have like a responsibility to say Latin too. So
I love that. Thank you for bringing that up, that allyship too, and making sure that we're using that inclusive language. Yeah, I was hearing how the Latine has evolved from the Latinx, that the X really not being right, really incorporated in a lot of Spanish-based language or Spanish origin languages, and so the Latine being more acceptable in that space. And then the Hispanic really being separated, or people moving away from Hispanic because it really still ties us to that colonialism. And then so wanting to separate and pull away from that. And so shifting from Hispanic in that space. You both brought up interesting points around the checking of the boxes, right? And like this term. And I feel like it causes so much internal conflict when I have to fill out forms and check off boxes. And one with the ethnicity of like, you're either Hispanic or you're not. Like those are the only two options.
literally.
How does that feel for both of you when you go through that or experience that too?
I hate it. I'm like, yeah, like, but I'm more than just yes, no. Like, I don't know. I don't know. I just don't. I don't like it. That's it. That's my answer.
Right. And I feel like I mentioned before, I hate the boxes, right? A census time comes around, hate that because there's not even a box for me. I feel like, for my whole identity, you have to really put weight on one more than the other. And that's really unfair to all of our ancestors and all of our heritage and our just pride of where we come from. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating that the system is still tracking this information in so many spaces. I do get the wanting to track a certain demographic to ensure that there's parity and that ensure that there's equity in services and all of that. I get it. But I feel like there are other factors that could be the identifiers versus race, which I feel like we all human, we all bleed, we like that's our race, and versus ethnicity and using those.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting how like race was created really to separate, and so they still utilize it as that tool to separate in that piece. But then it's like, and then people from Caribbean and Spanish speaking areas came in, right? And they didn't know what to do with us. They were like, oh, well, you could check off either way, and we don't want you getting mixed in with white people. So we're going to create this separate piece for you to recognize that you're separated in that sense too. The way all of these things have come up for sure.
Yeah.
And I wonder too, like when growing up, has your identity or how you identify changed since you were kind of raised? Because I remember being raised in it kind of being like, this is what you are, right? This is what you would check off, or this is how you would identify. And then coming into my own person, have definitely recognized it to be different in that way.
For sure. For me personally, I was raised to identify as Puerto Rican. That was it. And anyone not Puerto Rican was Americano, right? And I would always be like, but we're American too, right? And then like growing up and learning, it wasn't until after college, you would think, because we don't have any representation in the history books, even though our people have been a part of the history for hundreds of years. We don't have representation of our own history and our own story. So it wasn't until after college and self-education and exposure that I was able to really dig into the colonizer term of Puerto Rican versus Boricua, which is more of the Taino term. And that's why I choose to use that term, because it is the indigenous name of the island. And really honor. I've always known that my family was of mixed ethnic origins, right? Like you look at my family, it's a rainbow of beautiful people. And so for me personally, adding the Afro Taino Boricua to my ethnicity is important, because I want all of my ancestors to be honored for their survival. And not only that, like for bringing me here today. And learning more and more of that history and where I came from and where my family came from really shaped me to how I identify today.
Yeah. In my case, I went from mestiza or India to Latina Afro-Caribbean. Yeah, I definitely don't call mestiza. I don't call myself mestiza in India anymore. Those were the terms over there back in the Dominican Republic. And honestly, I didn't even think about that much. It's not even. It wasn't. Race and ethnicity wasn't something that I thought about back in the Dominican Republic, because Dominicans are the quote unquote Dominican group. And of course, we have Haitians, and we do have an Asian population, but Dominicans, that's the default in the Dominican Republic. We have the structural power. So we don't have to think about I'm Dominican and this comes with certain things, or we don't have to think about that at all. So going from not thinking about your race, ethnicity, to you actually have to think about this now. This is about survival, was very, and still is very hard. But yeah, and for me to go to the definition of Afro-Caribbean, that took me 10 years, and I have been here for 13 years. So I started to identify as Afro-Caribbean like 3 years ago, and it took me that long because there's a lot of colorism and anti-Blackness back in the Dominican Republic, so I didn't want to identify as Black ever. Of course, until 3 years ago, I started to dismantle all of that BS. So,
yeah. I think what you're saying is also important, like dismantling, like using these terms and adding Afro in front of our identifier is so important. Like there has been historical shame, and I think that was because of survival, right? Like if you identified as Black, then unfortunately in the colonizer world, that meant less than, to the main culture. And so to self-identify that way, that meant to bring danger to yourself and family, and to really level down in a sense, even though we know that's not true, right? And it takes work to dismantle that, and just adding that identifier is part of the work.
Yeah, I remember hearing stories from in my family of like people being looked down upon or not having people to get together because one was of darker skin, right? Meaning, and they came from more of a farming background than the individuals that had lighter skin, that had more of the European blood or were believed to have more of the European blood, right? And so not wanting to have them get together, right? And what that meant. And so the colorism really showing up in that, right? It's kind of like what we think about in regards to, in America and the colorism, even between African Americans or individuals who would identify as Black, and the idea of essentially which people who were enslaved were allowed to do which jobs and be present in which areas.
Yeah.
And what that looked
Yeah,
like.
like that brown paper bag test. And I mean, my grandmother always refers to, oh, my family didn't want me to marry your grandfather because then we'll have dark children and yada, 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 because she was darker herself. And they were like, well, two darks equal very dark. Like, you know, let's not do that. We want to lighten it. So, I mean, clearly she fell in love with my grandfather and color didn't matter, but colorism was real, like growing up, and it was inherited, unfortunately, you know, through conversations and just the way like my elders talked. But I will say I'm so proud and happy that through their own aging and experiencing life, like they've grown through that.
Mhm.
You know, it's no longer it's no longer there. Like I don't see it. Like I can remember moments as a child hearing, you know, these terms that, you know, meant negatively, you know, towards, you know, the blacker pigment. And now nada. So I'm very happy that it's growing that way.
Mm.
I don't know if you all have experience. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Isabel.
I wanted to introduce the question about names because I feel I don't really have a choice in identifying as a, you know, like Latina or whatever, because people already, by my accent and then my name, they're like, oh, you are not from here. Like, you are definitely from somewhere else. And I feel that many people don't have really a choice in with these labels. You know, just with a Y in my name, Isabel, the Y and then the Garcia and then my accent, you know, it's not like I really think I don't really think I have a choice. I really don't. Whereas with my mom, her name is Melania and she's white passing. So maybe she's less categorized or less, but then she only speaks Spanish. So then it's like, oh no, you're not from here. Bye. So yeah. So I was just wondering if you have had experiences like with your, like how your name, and then maybe the language, if you speak Spanish or not, and then how you identify. Like, is there any correlation? Do you feel there's a correlation there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I get it, right? Because people look at my name and they're like, "Oh, that's an interesting name," right? I like was sitting at the dentist, like getting asked 10,000 questions about my name, and like the dental hygienist like didn't believe that it didn't mean anything in Spanish. I was like, it's just Janice, like that's just my name, that's it. So that was interesting. And then my last name is actually Polish. It's my husband's name. So but people will think of it as being a Spanish last name. And so that definitely brings a lot. And people automatically assume that I speak Spanish all the time. I remember so many times where I was at work and a Spanish speaking person would come in and they would be like, "Oh, hold on." And they would turn to me and I'm like, "What? I don't know. What are you looking at me for? Like, I didn't speak Spanish yesterday. I don't speak it today. That it hasn't changed." Right. Which is not exactly something that I'm proud of, right? Like I wish that I would speak Spanish, but I just can't fluently. And I wouldn't want to harm someone by completely misinterpreting what they're trying to say. But yeah, definitely that assumption. And then it's funny because people will talk to me on the phone and then they'll meet me in person and they're like, "Oh, you sounded different on the phone." And I'm like, "Yeah, I sounded white on the phone. Is that what you meant?" Yeah. And I'm not what you expected when I show up. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, growing up in Western Mass, you know, I have Western Mass conditioning in my language. I will say yeah, because that's around me. That is real. We're country here in Western Mass. And like you, Janice, you know, growing up, Spanish was only spoken for commands or to get yelled at, basically for me, and like with my grandparents. So it was not something that I was taught to be comfortable speaking. So to this day, it's still a discomfort for me, and I'm not as knowledgeable. But growing up now as a child, I was really resentful about that. And even as a young adult, I was really resentful. Like, man, I wish my parents just talk to me in Spanish. Like, how much far ahead? Because of my physical being, people assume I talk Spanish fluently and that, like I am them, like the same, right? And I wish I wish I could be. But now, as I'm older, I recognize that was another form of protection that my parents tried to lay on me. My mom was English as a second language learner. And my father was first gen here to America. So they both spoke Spanish fluently as children. And my mom struggled in school because back in the day, you were put in ESL classes. You were assumed that we're going to put you all in this class and your curriculum is different, right? You're not being taught the same way as the mainstream students. So now as an older adult, I get that. Like, she didn't want me to be perceived and misperceived like she was as a child. She wanted me to thrive in this American world where English was the dominant language, and she wanted to give me the leg up. She didn't want me to have any stigma assigned to the language and identity. So I get it now, but still wish I could speak fluently. And I try to convince my brother, because my brother's wife is fluent, her grandparents are fluent, all the grandparents are fluent. Speak to the kids in Spanish. I will try to do it in my limited my limited vocabulary as much as I can, just to continue their exposure, because I know how much of a struggle it is to get over the hump when it's not your default, when it's not something you grew up with practicing.
Yeah, I felt like it was so hard, even from my own people too, right? Where people would look at me and start to speak to me in Spanish, and I would have to apologize and say, I'm sorry, I don't understand, or can you repeat that? And then they would say, oh, but you look Spanish. What do you mean you don't speak Spanish? And it would hurt, right? Where I'd be like, I still am. I just don't know, right? And so that was definitely a feeling like I was always stuck in this middle place for a long time growing up, and kind of where do I belong type of feeling too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it can go from that to also, I became my parents' interpreter, right? Because I know Spanish and also I know English. So now I'm going to be everyone's interpreter. So I'm just saying, there's pros and cons to all of this. I'm just saying, you know what it's very complex. That's all I'm trying to say. Yeah.
It is. But I get that, because English wasn't my mother's strong suit, and language and just learning barriers like dyslexia and things like that. I had to be the form filler outer. I had to listen to, I still was the interpreter, but it was, in a different way. It was in a different way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too to think about it, and the value of speaking the language and speaking Spanish, but Spanish also being a language of colonizers too, right? And so thinking about, our Taino people and the language that they spoke before they were colonized and Spanish was brought to the islands. And so that's been something that I've been very interested in and trying to do some reading and research about. But yeah, so even digging deeper than that for us.
Yeah, there's been some revitalization in the Taino language, but language it's evolutionary, and there's many words for the same things, and people will argue because there's different dialects, right, of the same language. But there's a beautiful movement that is building that dictionary of words and a revival of that history, right, and culture. And I personally, I'm learning Taino, just the little words and phrases, and trying to integrate it in my everyday dialogues, just so that it becomes normal, and that we're no longer, we're kind of erasing the erasure that has existed thus far, right? Like just using words and staking our claim to them. And understanding that there are different dialects, and it's meant to evolve. And if it's not because we've been erased, we don't have this document, and we weren't a written people. So like we don't have this document to say this means that, but many of our words are still out there, you know? It's beautiful. It's beautiful to realize that these colonizers came, and we still able to stay claiming a lot of words that are even adopted in English, barbacoa, canoa, you know, like so many words. But yeah, it's definitely part of the journey of reclaiming.
Yeah.
I think I love the fact that you identify as Taino or Taina. I want to, but I feel like I can't because I haven't done that DNA test, right? I feel like that thing they want to whatever in me or whatever that is. I feel like I need a validation or a paper or something that says, yeah, you can call yourself that. And that's the same with Blackness, right? Am I dark enough to say Afro before the Caribbean? So I feel that even to get to that label, to embrace these different categories, I feel like, again, like the Spanish, do you speak Spanish or not? Like I feel society places certain requirements in order to get to that label in the first place. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting.
For sure. I want to say, but that's part of that white supremacy culture, right? The needing to prove your purity, prove it through DNA. I'm sorry, but most indigenous nations did not require a DNA test to adopt you and to share their culture and to call you family. And if you are adopted by a Taino tribe, or if your family history seems aligned, like you have those stories, you don't need a DNA test. It's kind of like the decolonizing of our thoughts. I mean, I took a DNA test because it was fun at the time. And so it is validating, you know, it's validating to see how much, you know, African am I, and how much indigenous am I, and how much European am I, and where in Europe, and like, oh, 0.1% Irish, that's amazing. Like, what is that story, right? Like learning all these little things, it is great, you know, but it's not necessary. But I totally get the needing of that sort of validation, because it wasn't until I was 36, I think, that I really started to identify it, and that's just a few years ago, because I didn't feel comfortable either. But then as I started to learn more and really honor and wanting to stop the erasure, like if we start claiming it, then they can't say we're no longer here.
Yeah. It is so hard. I mean, that idea, like, there's so much privilege that comes with being able to trace a family tree, right? And to be able to do that. Like, yeah, I could take the DNA test, and I have too, where, yeah, it'll give me the breakdown of, you know, the blood and the ethnic heritage there. But I could never trace back a family tree. Like, there's no documentation. There's so much trauma that there's not stories that have been told, right? We can only go back so far. And even then, it's very limited in the amount of information that wants to be shared or is available to share. So there's no way to go back and really trace all of that. So it's interesting to think about even the amount of privilege that comes with being able to do that, and how so much of that plays into your identity too. And so not having that story, not having those stories that go back that far to be able to, I feel like, help with establishing or feeling like my identity is hard too. But yeah, I totally agree. You know, it's this white supremacy idea of like, you have to be so much, right? For some reason in this country, you have to claim like or prove over 50% to be considered indigenous. But then we've had laws where one drop of blood and you're considered Black or African American, right? And so it's ass backwards around everything. And it makes everything just so much complicated and difficult for us.
For sure. And even if, so like you were saying, like, even if you were able to prove you're 50% indigenous via some DNA test, you have to be from a recognized tribe or nation.
Right. Who gets to choose what's recognized, right?
And then, like, how do you get recognized? There's a huge,
Yeah.
movement of, and one of the, like, the Taino movements is to put on the census indigenous and write Taino in. So that way, when they count the census, they can see how many responses fall in that box, right? And it gives the nation some street cred. And registering with them can give them some accreditation so they can be accredited. Like, it's horrible that there has to be this application process.
Yeah. It's for us to kind of come together in being able to claim our identities and being able to be recognized in this way, which is sad that we have to do that.
I think one thing we can do to support each other is just honor however we each identify, and not perpetuate that system and challenge proof and challenge stereotypes, like adhere to those stereotypes. Oh, you look brown, you have curly hair, you must speak Spanish. Like, challenge that.
Yeah. I will say something that helped me be comfortable in the identities that I have now is to fight that anti-Blackness and that colorism. So dismantling all these beliefs that are attached to certain identities, I think, is part of that journey of identifying with your culture.
Yeah. I hope this conversation today, when other folks watch it, kind of recognize that they're not alone in that process of really finding out who we are, right? And that changes too. How we identify and our identity will change over time too, and that's okay. I think we need to normalize not feeling like our identity is set in stone, or normalize questioning who we are all the time. That's okay for us to be able to do that. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both for coming on today and having this conversation. I think it's the perfect way to kind of come to the end of Hispanic Heritage Month, which comes in between 2 months, which I think also speaks to how we are recognized or regarded in this country, right? But thank you both for coming on for this conversation. And I really appreciate you all and kicking off our YouTube series for the collective as well. So thank you so much.
For having us. I love this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.